The night was colder than memory. Somewhere in the black silence, a woman stood at the edge of a frozen pond. Her silk robes, once bright as spring blossoms, now clung to her like the shroud of a ghost. She didn't speak. She didn't pray. She simply looked at the water as if it were the last unbroken mirror in her shattered world. The Jin soldiers were sleeping in their tents behind her, bellies warm with stolen wine. She could have screamed. She could have begged. She could have cursed the heavens for what they had taken. Instead, she loosened the ties around her wrists, letting the last strip of fine silk slip through her fingers. It fluttered into the wind like a dying petal. They had taken her husband's crown. They had taken her city. They had paraded her like an animal. But there was one thing they could not take: the way she chose to end her story. She stepped forward. The water opened around her ankles like the mouth of an ancient god. Her breath hissed in the cold, but she didn't turn back. The pond swallowed her knees, her waist, her chest. The world grew quieter with every heartbeat. The last thing she felt was the icy weight pulling her down, wrapping her like a blanket. Some would later say she died for pride. Others would say it was shame. But those who understood knew it was neither. It was defiance, the only weapon she had left. By morning, the Jin camp stirred to the news. The Song Empress was gone. Soldiers muttered, nobles sneered, but the Jin Emperor himself paused. He asked who she had been, the one who did not cry, who did not plead, who had simply walked into the dark. Her name was Zhu Yan, known to history as Empress Zhu. She had been 26 years old. This is not the story of her death. It is the story of the years, the choices, and the betrayals that led her to the edge of that frozen pond, and the silence she left behind. Long before the frozen pond, before the humiliation and chains, Zhu Yan's world was painted in silk and sunlight. She was born in 1102, in a household where the clink of armor and the rustle of fine robes were equally familiar sounds. Her father, General Zhu Bu, was a respected military commander, the kind of man whose presence could silence a hall. Her mother, refined and reserved, ensured her daughter was schooled in the graces expected of a lady destined for greatness. From the age of 6, Zhu Yan's world was a gallery of knowledge. Tutors arrived daily, carrying scrolls, brushes, and the measured patience of scholars. She learned calligraphy so fluid it was said her ink strokes breathed. She memorized poems older than the dynasty itself, their words like threads binding her to the ancestors. She painted cranes and plum blossoms, images of grace and endurance, and her work began to pass quietly among the court's inner circles. She was beautiful, yes, but it was her composure that made people look twice. In the tea houses where the court gossiped, they said she could sit for an hour without shifting in her seat, eyes lowered, mind elsewhere, and still command the room. Her father's ambitions for her were not modest. Suitors came, sons of ministers, decorated captains, men with fortunes, but he brushed them aside. He saw in his daughter not just a bride, but a bridge to the imperial family. Fate, or perhaps calculation, agreed with him. The young crown prince Zhao Huan, future Emperor Qinzong, saw her during a palace gathering. He was a man who appreciated beauty wrapped in intellect, and Zhu Yan's elegance struck him like an arrow. They spoke briefly, about paintings, not politics, but in the intricate dance of courtship that was enough. By the time she was 14, she had entered the palace as one of his consorts. The transition from her father's house to the imperial corridors was like stepping from a private garden into a boundless, glittering labyrinth. Inside, everything was grand, yet everything had rules. She navigated it well. Her quiet grace, her art, her refusal to join in petty rivalries, all won her the favor of the crown prince. Before long she bore him a son. Her place seemed secure. But outside the palace walls, the empire's foundations were shifting, and in the cold north, a new power was watching. The year was 1120, and the empire Zhu Yan now called home was already trembling beneath its own weight. The Northern Song had wealth, art, and centuries of prestige, but its leaders had grown soft. The court was a place of poetry recitals and garden parties while the northern borders burned. In those same years, a new predator was rising, the Jin dynasty. They moved like winter storms, swift, unrelenting, and impossible to bargain with. The Song Emperor Huizong, Zhu Yan's father-in-law, made a fateful decision: ally with the Jin to destroy the Liao dynasty. It was a victory on paper, but it tore away the buffer that had protected the Song for generations. Once the Liao were gone, the Jin looked south. By 1125, sensing disaster, Huizong abdicated, passing the throne to his son, Zhao Huan, now Emperor Qinzong. Zhu Yan, elevated to empress, was crowned at a time when the empire was already in retreat. The enemy did not wait. The first Jin assault came swift and brutal. Inside the capital of Bianjing, panic spread. Many palace women stayed hidden, waiting for orders. Empress Zhu did not. She stepped into the freezing courtyards, gathered her attendants, and began organizing the production of warm clothing for the soldiers. She stitched alongside the maids, her hands raw from the cold, her voice steady as she urged others on. Word of her work spread through the capital, drawing noble women and commoners alike into the effort. When the soldiers received the sudden flood of winter garments, morale surged. For a brief moment, the Song forces pushed the Jin back from the gates. But the reprieve was short-lived. Emperor Qinzong hesitated at the edge of victory, seeking peace instead of pressing forward. To the Jin it was the scent of weakness. They returned the next year with greater force. The second siege was a disaster. Orders shifted hourly. Generals were chosen for their pedigree, not their skill. The Jin breached the walls. As the capital fell in early 1127, Empress Zhu's world collapsed in hours. The palaces where she had once painted cranes now echoed with the shouts of foreign soldiers. The imperial family, stripped of titles and finery, was herded together like prisoners. Winter bit at their skin as the long march north began. For Empress Zhu, the war was no longer fought with armies. It was fought in the space between surrender and defiance, and she had already chosen her side. The march north was a death by 1,000 small degradations. The Jin soldiers gave no warm clothing, no proper food, no rest beyond the frozen ground. Snow stung like shards of glass. Hunger turned days into a blur. Some captives collapsed and were left where they fell. No one stopped. When the survivors finally reached Jin territory in 1128, they were led not to shelter, but to a stage. It was the ancestral temple of the Jin rulers, a place of reverence, now transformed into a theater of conquest. The ceremony was called the Sheep Parade. Every captured member of the Song imperial family was stripped of their upper garments. They were dressed in rough sheepskins, ropes tied tight around their necks. Empress Zhu stood among them, her hair unbound, the winter air cutting into her skin. The ropes pulled them forward, barefoot, across the temple grounds. Soldiers laughed. Nobles jeered. Villagers stared as the royal prisoners shuffled past, heads bowed, their former majesty reduced to a grotesque parody. For a woman raised in the Confucian ideals of honor and chastity, it was not merely humiliation, it was an erasure of self. It did not end there. The women were ordered to bathe in the open, guards watching with smirks. They were forced to serve wine to the same men who had invaded their homeland, to clean chambers, to endure hands that saw them not as people but as spoils of war. And yet Empress Zhu did not scream. She did not weep in public. Her stillness unsettled even her captors. Whispers spread that the Jin emperor himself had asked about the woman who never cried. But stillness is not the same as peace. Alone in her quarters one night, she fashioned a rope and tried to hang herself. The attempt failed. She was cut down, placed under constant watch. Her world, already stripped of freedom, narrowed to the size of her guarded chamber. In the Jin camp, survival meant submission. But for her, submission was worse than death. The cold water of the northern rivers began to haunt her thoughts. A final escape the Jin could not take away. The next time the opportunity came, she would not be stopped. It happened quietly. There was no moon that night, only the pale outline of tents and the muffled snore of guards who thought their prisoners too broken to act. But Empress Zhu had been waiting. She slipped from her chamber, her bare feet silent against the frozen earth. The campfires burned low. Beyond the rows of tents, a pond lay still and black, its surface whispering with the faint crack of ice. She stepped to the edge. No farewell, no prayer. Only the knowledge that this choice was hers alone. She stepped into the water. The cold surged up her body, biting into flesh and bone, yet she kept going, each step deeper, each breath shorter. The water closed over her head, and the world fell silent. By dawn she was gone. The Jin soldiers muttered, some amused, others uneasy. But when word reached Emperor Taizong of Jin, his reaction surprised many. He ordered her remembered with the title Lady of Virtuous Chastity of Jingkong, a rare honor for a conquered enemy. Perhaps it was admiration. Perhaps politics. But in that moment, even her captor could not ignore the defiance in her final act. Her husband, Emperor Qinzong, lived on in captivity until 1156, a shadow of the ruler he once was. Her father-in-law, Emperor Huizong, died earlier, stripped of dignity and mocked with titles meant to sting. Both men were remembered for surrender. Empress Zhu was remembered for the opposite. In the Southern Song Court, her story became a lantern in a dark age. Chroniclers praised her loyalty and courage. Poets turned her into a symbol of resistance. Mothers told their daughters about the empress who chose water over shame. Her death, in a culture where female virtue was bound to chastity and honor, was recast as the highest act of self-respect. Over centuries, her name appeared in history books, commentaries, even plays. Some saw her as a martyr of virtue. Others called her a tragic victim of a brutal age. But all agreed she had not bowed. And so the girl born into silk, who died in icy silence, outlived the emperors who once ruled beside her. Her body was lost to the water. Her voice was lost to time. But her choice, that final step into the dark, became the one thing her enemies could never erase.